Missiles soar over the border of Finland. Russian tanks plow through a series of defenses. Soldiers slaughter one another as they battle for Helsinki. Vladimir Putin has lost any ounce of sanity and has invaded Finland. Lucky for the rest of the world, this will be the last thing he ever does. Finland is more than capable of defending itself, but they have a surprise up their sleeve. As Russia invades another neighbor, they're not just met by Finnish troops, but tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels that have an American flag emblazoned on them. Putin's gone too far this time, and the United States will make him pay. This is one of the many possible scenarios that could unfold if Russia attacks Finland. The extent to which the United States would get involved in a conflict between Finland and Russia depends on what actions Putin takes. A full-scale invasion would elicit a very different reaction from the United States than a series of skirmishes along the border of the two nations. That being said, if Putin resorted to using nukes against Finland, the US response would be swift and catastrophic. Let's take a look at several different scenarios involving a war between Finland and Russia to see the extent to which the United States would go. Now, before we get started, let's make one thing very clear. Attacking Finland is the last thing that Russia should be worried about right now. Russian forces are so consumed with the war in Ukraine that an invasion of another country would be unthinkable. Putin just doesn't have the manpower, weapons, or vehicles to wage another war without being crushed on multiple fronts. Therefore, he would literally have to be out of his mind to invade Finland. Although if anyone is crazy enough to invade a second country while losing a war they're already fighting, it would probably be Putin. Finland shares an 800-mile border with Russia, which is the longest of any nation in the European Union. This, along with the fact that Russia and Finland have had a turbulent past, has Finnish leaders a little on edge. Finland has a population of just over 5.5 million people, while Russia's population is around 143 million. However, it is important to remember that Russia is massive. In fact, Russia's landmass is around 51 times larger than Finland's. When all this is considered, it appears Finland would be on the losing side of any conflict between the two nations. But as we know from the war in Ukraine, size doesn't always matter. Finland's economy has been on an upward trend since 2015, and so is close to reaching $300 billion annually. The Russian economy, on the other hand, is starting to stall and eventually will go into crippling decline as the sanctions placed on Russia by the West take hold. These will cause long-lasting effects, and a lot of Russia's current and future economic problems can be traced back to the United States policies. The exact opposite can be said about the economic relationship between Finland and the US. Economic agreements between these two countries have only helped Finland's economy. When we look at the future of Russia and Finland, it seems that the latter is in a much better position than its neighbor. However, Vladimir Putin probably doesn't look at statistics or data before making decisions. At the very least, he tends to ignore information that does not confirm what he wants. Therefore, a Russian invasion of Finland might be driven by pure greed and paranoia rather than any type of strategic planning. So let's look at Finland's military and then focus on exactly what the United States would do to aid the Finnish defense forces if Russia ever attacked. The Finnish defense forces have been preparing to protect the nation from Russia ever since its conception. Finland gained independence from the Russian Empire in 1917, but quickly found itself once again under threat of invasion by the Soviet Union during World War II. Finland managed to maintain its sovereignty at the end of the war, but has been incredibly wary of its neighbor to the east ever since. The Finnish Air Force consists of around 166 aircraft, of which only 55 are fighters. More specifically, these planes are U.S. McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornets. These are formidable aircraft, but it is the 64 Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning IIs that Finland has on order that will really strengthen their military capabilities in the air. Finland also has around 240 tanks, most of which are Leopard 2s, often considered one of the most capable tanks in the world. They've also been shown to make quick work of older Soviet-era tanks, like the ones Russia's been using more and more in Ukraine as its stockpile of tanks quickly diminishes. Finland also has around 800 artillery guns and 75 MLRS vehicles. The Finnish Navy is pretty much non-existent, with around 8 fast attack vessels and a handful of minesweepers. When compared to the Russian military, even in its weakened state, Finland is definitely outmanned and outgunned. But again, numbers aren't everything, and if a war ever broke out between the two nations, Finland would have some powerful allies, including the United States. The U.S. formally established diplomatic relations with Finland in 1919. Then in 1944, the U.S. severed its ties with Finland when the nation fought alongside Nazi Germany to protect itself from a Soviet invasion. However, once World War II ended, diplomatic relations between U.S. and Finland were once again re-established. During the Cold War, Finland's proximity to the USSR was of a particular interest to the United States. However, Finland was adamant about remaining neutral in the conflict and refused to openly aid the US or allow nuclear weapons to be deployed within their borders. However, the Finnish government was much more invested in the West winning the Cold War than the Soviet Union. This is because it seemed likely a powerful Russia would eventually want to extend its borders further, and Finland was a logical choice for a future invasion. The fear of a Soviet Union that could dominate Asia and Eastern Europe led to certain agreements and under-the-table dealings between the US and Finland. This helped strengthen the ties between the two governments. However, in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the US ramped up its efforts to help support Finland in its non-alignment policies while also reinforcing their cultural and economic ties to the West. Basically, the US promoted any agreements that would bring Finland closer to NATO and Europe. And although it claimed to support the neutrality of Finland, the US government almost certainly had ulterior motives for Finland due to its strategic location. If Finland became more reliant on the US and Western powers, it was unlikely that communism or a similar form of authoritarian rule would take hold in the nation. And for the US and much of Europe, that was and is still the goal. Then in 2016, the United States and Finland signed a bilateral statement of intent. There were several objectives of this agreement. The first was to deepen bilateral and multilateral dialogue and defense policies. What this meant was the US wanted to start working more closely with Finland to ensure its military tactics and procedures were closely aligned with its own. In extension, this would set up Finland to join NATO more easily in the future, since interoperability between militaries is a requirement for being accepted into the organization. The statement of intent would also increase the strategic information shared by both nations. Obviously, the one country that both Finland and the US were most concerned about was Russia, and therefore the information sharing likely had a lot to do with Finland's neighbor to the east and what they were up to. Another major aspect of the agreement was to increase the planning of joint training exercises, which would not only benefit Finland's military, but would also set the groundwork for US troops and vessels to be located in and around the area. The statement of intent included the United States' desire to increase armament cooperation in collaboration in research, development, test, and evaluation as well. With each aspect of this agreement, it became more and more clear that the US wanted to militarize Finland in a way that it could easily work with them in the future if their neighbor ever became aggressive. Everything that is discussed in the statement of intent between Finland and the United States seems to be set up to groom Finland to become part of NATO in the future. This itself could have been part of a plan of deterrence to keep Russia in check, but it also allowed the United States to be in a unique and strategic position to aid Finland if they ever went to war. The United States and Finland have also been in cooperation in peace support missions such as NATO-led operations in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq. It's hard to ignore just how much time, effort, and resources have gone into helping Finland grow its military and modernize its tactics. The United States has played a huge role in doing this, and therefore it would be very unlikely that they would sit by and do nothing if Russia ever invaded Finland. So in the current state of things, Finland and the United States have good relations, several trade agreements, and the US is heavily invested in maintaining the status quo of pro-Western ideologies and alliances in the country. This means that if Russia did invade Finland, the US would respond. The extent and severity of the response would be directly connected to the type of attack Russia initiates against Finland. Scenario 1. Russia invades Finland using similar tactics as in Ukraine. In this scenario, the United States would likely provide a huge amount of military, financial, and humanitarian aid to Finland. Again, the attacking force would likely be much weaker than the initial invasion of Ukraine, because the war has taken a significant toll on the number of soldiers and weapons that Russia has at its disposal. That being said, the leadership of Russia has shown time and time again that they don't mind throwing huge numbers of inexperienced young men at another military force with the hopes of overwhelming them. In the past, this occasionally worked, but with devastating consequences in terms of casualties and resources lost. The United States, like the rest of the world, has learned a lot from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If Russia began posturing and moving troops to the border of Finland, the US would not take such actions lightly. When Russia did this in Ukraine, the United States and the West threatened sanctions, which they later imposed. However, this obviously did not stop the invasion itself. Therefore, the US would likely take a much more aggressive approach if it seems that Russia was going to use tanks, armored vehicles, and troops to attack Finland. The United States would likely send similar types of weapons that they've proven to be effective in Ukraine. The great thing for both Finland and the US in this scenario is that they literally know what works well and what works really well against the Russian military. The US would send javelins to allow Finland's far inferior numbers to decimate Russian tanks and vehicles. The javelin is a fire-and-forget weapon because the missile locks onto its target before being launched. This means that when the Finnish troops fire at a Russian target, they can immediately fall back to cover even before the missile hits its mark. This would provide the Finns with excellent mobility and striking power that Russia would not be able to deal with. Like in Ukraine, the Finnish landscape would be littered with the husks of destroyed Russian tanks. Along with the javelins, the US would also send M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system, or the HIMARS. The US Army identifies HIMARS as a full-spectrum, combat-proven, all-weather, 24/7, lethal and responsive wheeled precision strike weapon system. And at least in the war in Ukraine, this has been absolutely true. HIMARS can launch 6 long-range rockets either simultaneously or at different times, and then immediately move its position to get out of danger. The rocket's range is about 50 miles or between 70 to 80 kilometers. These vehicles would allow Finland to decimate any Russian forces within their borders and push them back out of their territory. The rockets are incredibly accurate and would allow the Finnish army to hit targets far behind the front lines, such as weapon caches or command outposts. And we've seen in recent months, the United States would almost certainly send tanks to Finland as well. A-1 Abrams could be used by Finland to launch their own offensives and quickly take back any territory that Russia's invaded. These tanks are state-of-the-art and could make quick work of entire battalions of Soviet-era tanks. Of course, the United States would also send guns, explosives, and artillery rounds just like they have in Ukraine. The United States may even take things a step further and provide Finland with more aircraft or at least expedite the delivery of the F-35 Lightning IIs that Finland's already purchased. What it comes down to is that the US would not hesitate to deliver military aid to Finland. As the war progressed in Ukraine, the US has ramped up its commitment to deliver weapons and vehicles that the Ukrainian military desperately needs. However, if Russia was to invade Finland, the response by the United States would likely be much more immediate. To put this into perspective, the United States has sent close to $80 billion in aid to Ukraine since the war began. The US has the largest economy in the world, and although $80 billion is a lot of money, it's only a drop in the bucket when it comes to the US defense spending. In 2021, the United States spent about $801 billion on its military. There is little doubt that Congress would pass a Finnish relief bill that would authorize huge sums of money and weapons to be sent to Finland if they were ever invaded by Russia. There's also the possibility that the United States would take a much more aggressive stance if Russia started to amass troops on the Finnish border. Rather than waiting until Russia invaded, the US could deploy its own forces in a joint operation with Finland, which would act as a deterrent for Russia. If Russia invaded and American troops were caught in the crossfire, it may be seen as an act of war against the US. They could claim that Russia was not only the aggressor but attacked American troops intentionally, allowing the US to declare war on Russia. This tactic has been used by NATO in recent months as they send more and more troops to countries that share a border with Ukraine. This has been done to stop any further progress Russia could make if it won the war. The moment Russia attacks a NATO force, either on purpose or by accident, all nations, including the United States, would declare war on Russia, and that's not a war Putin could win. And this brings up another interesting point about a Russian invasion of Finland. Sweden and Finland applied to join NATO in May of 2022. Neither country has been accepted yet due to Hungary and Turkey holding out on their ratification. However, there might be a way for the United States and NATO to get around this technicality if Finland were attacked. Finland is a member of the European Union. Until recently, Finland has tried to maintain its neutrality, but an aggressive Russia has caused them to drop that stance and seek alliances. Since the countries in the EU engage in the common security and defense policy, Finland could invoke this article if Russia attacked, which would bring other European nations to their aid. If Russia continues to wage war while other EU forces are in Finland, it could be considered an act of war against those nations, many of which are NATO members. This would inevitably trigger Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, and every member of NATO would declare war on Russia, including the US. Ukraine was an EU candidate when Russia invaded, so it did not have the benefit of the common security and defense policy. Finland, however, is a much different story. They're currently a member of the European Union, which means if Russia invaded, it is highly probable the US would find some way to join the other European NATO members in declaring war against Russia. Scenario 2. Russia uses gray zone tactics and launches conventional missiles into Finland but does not invade. If Russia attacked Finland by firing missiles or disrupting its trading capabilities in the Baltic Sea through blockades, the US's response would likely be slightly different than if there was a full-on invasion. These disruption tactics would definitely cause concern, and if missiles were fired, Finland and the rest of NATO would certainly call it an act of war, but they might not retaliate with force. There would undoubtedly be a misinformation campaign by Russia saying the West was setting them up or the missiles were an accident. But in reality, the rest of the world would know such an attack was meant to scare Finland and the rest of Europe into making concessions. This might have been more effective before the war in Ukraine, but if Russia tried to pull a stunt like this today, the US would have none of it. It's possible that, like with Taiwan, the US might openly state that if Russia continued to be aggressive or invaded Finland, the US would stand by them. This is not so much an alliance as a promise. In this case, the US would almost certainly deploy troops to Finland and NATO countries nearby in preparation for a retaliatory strike into Russia. This would be done to deter any further Russian aggression, and it would likely work, as Putin knows that even at its strongest, the Russian military could never defeat the US. Perhaps one of the best indicators of what the US would do in this scenario is by looking at what they've already done. In November of 2022, President Joe Biden approved a $323 million arms sale to Finland. This sale included tactical missiles and joint standoff weapons, so it seems the US is already helping Finland prepare for a conflict with Russia. There's no other reason for Finland to procure tactical missiles from the US other than to mount a defense or act as a deterrent against a Russian attack. But things don't stop there. The US then approved an additional $380 million sale of missiles to Finland only days after the first arms deal went through. The second sale was possibly for Stinger anti-aircraft missile launchers and other similar equipment. As of right now, the US and Finland believe that a Russian attack by air is the most likely scenario if Putin dares to become aggressive against Finland. The United States released a statement explaining that the proposed sale will improve Finland's defense and deterrence capabilities. Finland intends to use these defense articles and services to increase its national stock. This critical platform will bolster the land and air defense capabilities in Europe's northern flank, supporting US-European Command's top priorities. This makes it very clear that even though Russia is in no position to attack Finland, the United States and NATO are still proactively working to deter even the thought of Putin setting his sights on his Nordic neighbor. However, if the mad dictator decided to launch an attack anyway, Finland would already have some defenses ready to go, and there is little doubt that if the missiles were launched or aircraft were used by Russia to attack Finland, the US would make it one of its top priorities to get Finland the anti-air defense capabilities they need. It's also probable that the US would deploy more forces to the region, similar to scenario number 1, to send a message to Russia if the attacks continue, things will escalate. It's hard to imagine a scenario where Russia becomes an aggressor and the US doesn't find a way to insert itself into the conflict in Finland. Both nations have already been actively working together to prepare for such a scenario that the foundation is already in place. The US is willing and able to play an active role in the defense of Finland if it ever comes to it. Scenario 3. Russia attacks Finland with nuclear weapons. This is definitely the most unlikely scenario, but one worth examining. Finland does not have any nuclear weapons within its borders, at least that we know of. Therefore, a nuclear strike against Finland would be met by a unified global response against Russia. Pretty much every nation in the world, including China, would condemn Russia's actions. The United States would immediately go on high alert, and every branch of the U.S. nuclear triad would await striking orders. U.S. submarines would deploy to strategic locations alongside the Russian coast. B-2 bombers would take to the air and infiltrate Russian airspace. Land-based ballistic missile command centers would double-check trajectories over the Arctic to ensure optimal accuracy. A nuclear launch against Finland would absolutely bring the US and Russia to the brink of war. Not to mention, the rest of NATO would also actively be arming their nukes just in case Putin decided to launch any more missiles. This would be an end-of-the-world scenario. As we said, this is highly unlikely, but if the scenario ever did occur, the US would be at the forefront of bringing Putin and Russia to its knees. A Russian nuclear strike against Finland probably wouldn't result in World War III because China has made it clear it would not support Russia using nukes in Ukraine or in general. China itself has a strict defensive-only policy when it comes to using nuclear weapons, and no matter which way Putin spins it, launching a nuke at Finland would never be seen as a defensive action. North Korea might back Russia, but Finland, the US, and NATO have little to fear from North Korea. Japan and other East Asian countries that have closely allied themselves with the West would need to be slightly more wary, but North Korea's military capabilities are pretty limited as it mostly relies on old Soviet tech and nuclear missiles that may or may not achieve liftoff before detonating. It's also probable that China would keep North Korea in check if Russia launched a nuclear attack on Finland, as they do not want to see the world end in a nuclear holocaust either. So if Putin ever launched nukes at Finland, the US would not be the only country coming to their aid. It would likely be a worldwide effort to remove Putin from power and make sure no further nuclear weapons are deployed. However, if the US felt that Russia would launch more nukes at Finland, or any other part of the world for that matter, it might feel warranted to launch its own nuclear attack against Russia to send a clear message that they are done messing around. These strikes would target already known Russian launch sites to hopefully destroy them before more nukes can be used. This could result in a series of exchanges that would leave parts of the planet irradiated and result in the loss of countless lives. Scenario 4. The most likely scenario. Russia is too weak to attack Finland. Even if the US hadn't already engaged in providing support, weapons, and joint military operations with Finland, Russia is in no position to invade another country. It is badly losing the war in Ukraine thanks to the resolve of the Ukrainian people and the weapons sent by the West. Men are being conscripted from across Russia to be used as cannon fodder as Putin desperately tries to hold on to the little territory Russia still controls in Ukraine. The scenarios discussed in this video would almost certainly lead to the Russian military being decimated, as they could not hope to fight two different countries simultaneously. Putin just doesn't have the strategic capabilities or resources at his disposal, and with each scenario, it's almost inevitable that the US would get involved in some way. The most likely outlook for the future of Russia right now is that they'll continue to fight in Ukraine until more Western tanks and weapons arrive, and the Ukrainian military eventually pushes them completely out of their country. At that point, Vladimir Putin will have to admit defeat, and the repercussions for his regime will be drastic. At the very least, he'll lose the faith of the Russian people, and his power will be greatly diminished. There would be no hope for a Russian victory if it launched any type of attack against Finland. In fact, an attack against Finland would be the nail in the coffin for Russia, as it would likely result in the US and members of the European Union taking a much more aggressive action, or perhaps even declaring war on Russia. And since Russia can't defeat the much smaller Ukrainian military, it has no hope of winning a war against the US and its allies. So the probability of Russia attacking Finland is small. We'll never say never, as Vladimir Putin has clearly shown he's out of his mind, but if Russia ever did attack Finland, the United States' response would be swift and merciless. Now watch how NATO would respond to a nuclear strike, or check out US World War III plan.